It's a welcoming honor to welcome Professor Nancy Unger of Santa Clara University again on this program. The last time she was on the show, we discussed the great progressive era senator, Robert Fighting Bob La Follette. And now we are discussing his lovely wife, Belle Case La Follette. Professor Unger has, of course, written a book about her, Belle La Follette, Progressive Era Reformer. Nancy, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks so much for having me back on. I'm looking forward to this.
Okay, so I should first like to begin by asking you, how is Bella Follett remembered today?
I don't think she is remembered very much today at all. I think she always falls into the shadow of her husband. And so she's kind of a footnote. Yes, he had this supportive wife because he's very open about the fact that they are, a team. But he always, is just in the foreground. And I have to say, when I wrote my biography of him, I kind of fell into this as well. And part of the problem is she's very self-deprecating. She's always, kind of, oh, I didn't do that much. She's not one who likes the spotlight. So I think, like a lot of scholars, I kind of took her at her word. And it was just like, oh, yeah, she was kind of helpful and in the background. And she's a rather shy person anyway. And so I think that I contributed, without realizing it, to this sort of minimizing her as a reformer in her own right. Yes, she was a big helpmate to her husband, but when you really look at her, just look at her, she's an amazing progressive reformer. And in some ways, she could be far more radical than he was because she never has to worry about getting reelected. She can go ahead and, really say what she means. And he never says to her, hey, honey, tone it down. He's just right in there, supporting her. So on some very controversial issues, like race, for example, she's very outspoken. So I think your question is an excellent one. That I think she is really not remembered much in history, and I think that's a shame because I think if she hadn't been Bob La Follette's wife, but had done all the things that she did, she would be remembered much more as as a really important reformer. But she continues to fall under his shadow.
Yes, and of course, I think that the era in which Bell as well as Robert belongs to, the progressive era, is one that is rarely discussed in American politics these days. I think along with the Reconstruction era as well. And I think as a student of American history, those are the two areas in which I would like some more studies and discussions to be had, and which is why I guess I have conversations with people like yourselves. So tell me about the contemporary legacy of the progressive era. What do you think it achieved?
I think that, as you are suggesting, it is really underappreciated, and the importance of it is undervalued. I try to get my students to, because when we talk about the progressive era, say, oh, they didn't do this and they didn't achieve that, and we still have, these various problems and so forth. And so I really have to take them deep into the first part of that era when we see just how corrupt American politics were, the tremendous disparity of wealth, the huge problems in urban areas with industrial disease and poverty and so forth. And yes, all of these are ongoing problems, but I try to get them to think, what would happen if the progressives hadn't made the progress that they did? What kind of country would this be without what they achieved? That despite overwhelming odds, they really did eliminate a lot of the corruption in American politics. They really did help get rid of the machine politics that were openly, blatantly running American cities. They did get worker safety. They did bring environmental reforms. They did bring the graduated income tax to more equitably redistribute the power. And I think that other thing they did that was really important is that they said very plainly to the American people, you can't just wait for your politicians to do this. You have to be involved. There was, Lincoln Steffens went around to all the major cities and talked about what he called the shame of the cities. So he'd go to Chicago or Detroit or whatever it was and say, here's all the corruption that is happening in your city. But that's not what's shameful. What's shameful is that you're accepting it. You're not talking about it. You are not rising up. So I think the progressive era eliminated some of the worst excesses. And I think it also brought the American people back to the notion that this is supposed to be a participatory democracy. So I think those are some of the things that it did, very successfully.
Yeah, the way I see it, the progressive era really was an era of larger than life figures. You have the presidents, of course, you have your Roosevelt and your Wilson. Even I guess William Jennings Bryan would be counted among them too. And of course, the La Follettes, they're all larger than life figures. Journalists like Steffens and even candidates like Eugene Debs. So would you say that their personalities help cement the progressive achievements that they've advocated for?
Yes, I think you're exactly right. Those figures that you just named, these are fiery, interesting people. I think you could have had their same goals and ideas, and they wouldn't have had the same impact if they hadn't been delivered in a way that got people excited. Who doesn't get excited about Theodore Roosevelt? I mean, like you say, he's this larger than life character. He's very colorful. The La Follettes were, even Belle La Follette in her quiet way was really mesmerizing as a speaker, and Bob La Follette was incredible. I think you're right that it's not only their programs and their ideas, it's the way they delivered them. And again, I think it was getting the American people to not just think, oh, those are politicians, has nothing to do with me, of getting people to say, yes, yes, I'm going to be involved in this. I see that this is, I think they were very engaging. And I think that's really important. You can't just have politicians up on high pontificating. If you want to have a democracy, you have to have people involved at all levels. And I think their personalities were very engaging in that regard.
Mhm. Of course, another legacy in which there's been some debate about is that the progressive era, um, I guess, involves more government into the lives of ordinary men and women. And uh, you know, for someone who leans towards a more conservative disposition, like myself, I see that as generally something to be avoided. So yeah, so I guess if you can provide like a case for the contrary, how is more government in our lives a good thing or at least a better thing than less?
Well, I think it really depends on what your current problems are and can they be solved in other ways. Um, where I think the progressives were very good in bringing about more government is that, I mean, this is the time in American history that until the Gilded Age and Progressive era, I don't think there was a need for a lot of government. Most Americans were farmers. They grew their own food. They controlled much of their own lives. They didn't need government involvement. I don't think we didn't really need it as a nation until we became this urbanized industrial nation. And then so the example I would give you is, okay, if you're a farmer, you grow your own food, you know what's going on, it's done. If you live in an American city during this period and you want to feed your family, and so you go to the meat market and you buy a bunch of sausage because that's what you're used to eating, and but you didn't make it yourself, and so you have no way of knowing that that sausage contains sawdust and all kinds of bad products and so forth, and your family gets sick and you think, oh my god, this is terrible, so you go to the drugstore and you buy, some medicine for them, and you have no way of knowing that it has turpentine and alcohol in it, and it's going to make them sicker. So there are now things that you can't regulate, and if no one regulates them, you're going to have, all kinds of terrible problems, unfairness, and so forth. So I think an urban industrial society needs government to say, no, no, we are making pure food and drug standards. Okay, if you're going to sell this in the United States, it has to pass certain safety standards. And yes, that requires that you create a board and you have to have investigators, and that's more government. But to my mind, that is more government that is necessary, and it's going to make the nation safer and stronger. So certainly, there's a lot of government that, maybe is not necessary and so forth. But in this particular case, in this time, I think the increase in government was necessary for the way that the nation was changing.
Well, let's focus on Bella Follett. How would you describe her early education as a feminist and a reformer?
Well, she's an interesting one. Her parents are farmers in Wisconsin, and she is unusual because many families, if they had limited income, as her family did, that they would educate boys rather than girls. And she is raised in a family that's like, oh no, she's going to go to college as well. It's very unusual for any American to go to college at this time, let alone, a woman. But she goes to the University of Wisconsin, and she is taken seriously by a couple of her professors, and then she starts taking herself seriously. And like Bob La Follette, her soon-to-be husband, the University of Wisconsin is a very progressive school at this time, and they get kind of steeped into uh, this rhetoric from the president, who says, look, you're some of the elite people in this country. You're getting a college education. The state of Wisconsin has given a lot to you. The nation has given a lot to you. What are you going to give back? And I think that is a really important sort of, underlies their whole approach to life. It's not like, oh, I'm going to college so I can get a good education so I can make money and be successful. It's like, okay, I've had this elite opportunity, and so now I have to dedicate myself to giving back and to raising up others. And they take this very seriously. Belle Follett is the most humorless person I can imagine. I mean, she just takes everything so seriously, and her kids, they end up having 4 children. And several of the letters from her children, like, for God's sake, mother, for 10 minutes, give it up. Just relax. But she can't. She takes this so seriously that it is her job to help and to give back. And that really dictates a lot of their marriage and her entire life. She really believes in this. And she also believes that there is nothing about her as a woman that precludes her from doing this and being dedicated to this. And she doesn't say, oh, I'm just a woman. I don't have the ability to do this. And the other reason that I really wanted to write a book about her is that most of the progressive women who are, very involved and active, Jane Addams is probably the best known. Most of them, like Jane Addams, never married. They didn't have children. They devoted themselves their entire lives to being progressive leaders. And Bella Follett is married. She has these 4 children. And she doesn't see that as a conflict. And I really admire that about her. That just like, yes, she says, and she gives speeches to young women saying, you don't feel that being married and having children precludes you from having a career, from having interests, from making a difference, and so forth. That's quite unusual in her day. Like I say, most reformers, you did one or the other, but not both. And she does both, and she doesn't say that it's easy, but she's just like, well, yes, of course, I want to do both these things, and they can be done.
So, does she feel that family and politics are complementary rather than, I guess, conflicting?
Yeah, I think she does. And I have to say, a lot of the reason she thinks that is that she gets the full support of her husband. He never says, what do you mean you're going to go give that speech? What about the children? He is behind her 100%. She is the first woman to graduate from the University of Wisconsin Law School. And she never practices law on her own. But at one point, Bob La Follette is giving a brief to the Wisconsin State Supreme Court. And the justice says, "Wow, that's a pretty good brief." And La Follette says, "Yeah, I know. My wife wrote it." He has no. I mean, he's just very supportive of her. If he hadn't been, I don't know what, if she'd married Theodore Roosevelt, no wife of his was going to be out there. He didn't even let his daughter go to college, because that's not the right place for women. So Belle La Follette went to the right school and married the right man, to because he just said yes, yeah, of course, and how can I help you, and so they really were a pretty good team.
Mhm. Yeah. On the subject of family, to what extent was she influential in the political career of her son, Junior Bob?
Oh, poor Junior, and this is where I really kind of fault the La Follettes. Bob La Follette decided from when Junior was a little kid that Junior was going to be his political successor. And he writes him these letters that are just, oh, but they call him Bobby. "Oh, Bobby, you're starting the world on my shoulders, and you have your mother's brain. It's the best brain in the world, and you're going to be a great success. And I see you as governor," and then blah, blah. This kid is 9 years old. And he writes back these literally tear-stained letters. "I'm only 9 years old, I mean, he just feels all of this pressure. And it's very sad because his younger brother, Phil, loves politics. He's the one who's politically ambitious. But when Bob La Follette Sr. dies, Junior is not, I'm sorry, Phil is not old enough to be senator, but La Follette Jr. is. And so he'd been pushed by his father and also by his mother to go into politics. And at one point, she realizes that maybe this isn't quite such a good idea. And she writes to her husband and says, "Bobby's had this kind of a breakdown, and maybe we need to pull back a little bit and let him figure out what he wants to do with his life." And Senior is kind of, no, he wants to be a politician. And she kind of falls into that as well. And so when Senior dies and Junior becomes the next senator from Wisconsin, she is just as his father did. He never does anything without consulting with her. She is his number one advisor. Um, so she pushes pretty hard as well.
Mhm. Yes. Of course, it can be quite difficult being the offspring of parents who are, well, larger than life, as I've said.
Well, and particularly, I mean, this guy had no political experience to become a US senator. I think the only thing he'd ever done was been president of his class at the University of Wisconsin. I mean, there was just nothing. I will add, though, because I think this is very it's a signature story about Bella Follett, that when Senior dies, she gets so many petitions, particularly from women, saying, "Please, Mrs. La Follette, please run for, be Senate, be the next senator. You can be the first woman senator. This would be so important to us. You can do it. Please do this." And she says in her self-deprecating way, "Oh no, it's, that's not for me." And so I just thought, oh, that kind of surprises me because she'd been such an advocate for women and she could have been the first woman senator. And, she certainly could have done it. But then I was reading, some of the stuff that she wrote about this privately. And what she said was, and I thought this was so significant. She said, "Yes, I could be the first woman senator, but it would just be an honor. It would be an honor for me to, finish out my husband's term, and then I would be done. They wouldn't come back to me to run again. Then they would run real candidates who are now going to take over the Senate seat." And she said, and maybe Junior would win and maybe he wouldn't. If we get Junior in there now, then he can run again in his own right after that first term. And we can keep the La Follette dynasty going and keep our progressive ideas going. So it wasn't, oh, no, I'll demur on this and so forth. It was a very strategic political decision that she felt it would be better for their progressive, agenda, that he serve rather than she be the first woman senator. I mean, that's how serious she was about their progressive agenda.
Mhm. Yes. And of course, the political career of Junior Bob kind of ended tragically, right? He committed suicide because of the McCarthy purges.
You know, it's always impossible to know why somebody commits suicide,
Mhm.
but when he was defeated by Joe McCarthy, he was devastated by this. And he said, I didn't do what my father always did. I didn't go back to Wisconsin. He always hated to campaign. He said, I didn't go back to Wisconsin. I didn't really campaign. And he feels terrible, terrible about this. And he gets into business and so forth, but he's in the end, yeah, he is a suicide. And it really is. I feel that his whole life, I mean, I think this is just sort of a tragic in the sense that it was his brother who really had the political ambition, but he's the one who ends up being senator, and he does it. I mean, he's a senator for longer than his father was, and he was a good senator, and he achieved a lot. But that wasn't, that was his father's passion, and with him, it was his familial duty. And I just think that's a hard way to go through life.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
So, tell me about some of the, I suppose, catalysts that led women like Jane Addams and Bella Follett to recognize their role in politics and social life, as well as their equality in standing with their male counterparts.
I think some of what motivated certainly Bella Follett in some ways, and a lot of women in the progressive movement, is a sort of an anti-feminism.
Mm,
This sense that men are just naturally sort of aggressive and they're the providers and they're going to do anything to make a profit. They're the ones who have to put food on the table. So, yeah, they'll cut corners and they'll sell adulterated drugs and, impure food and so forth. But women are the natural housekeepers and the mothers and so forth. And so they have sort of a more altruistic care down the generation. So some of Bella Follett's rhetoric, it's really interesting. Some of it is very much what I just described, talking about women as mothers and their altruism and so forth. And yet, in the same breath, she'll talk about, well, all people are created equal, and this is just ridiculous that we're talking about any difference between men and women. So it's an odd kind of mixture, but what's brilliant about it is it appeals to all women. If you're a woman who says, well, women shouldn't be involved in politics, they should be taking care of the home, she can say, well, how can they take care of the home if they can't be guaranteed pure food and drugs? How can they take care of the home? And she has this whole litany of things. So she appeals to those women who say, no, it's your womanly duty to get involved. And then to the minority of women who are true feminists at this time, she also has some very feminist rhetoric about, all people are created equal, and of course we should have the vote and so forth. So she has appeal all across the board.
mhm. So how did the First World War impacted the women's suffrage movement?
I'm sorry, what?
The First World War, how did it impact the women's suffrage movement?
Well, I think it does not get nearly enough credit for basically forcing women's suffrage. I think we like to have this romantic notion that it was women who were picketing at the White House and marching in parades and sending petitions that ultimately got women the vote. And certainly we wouldn't have the women's vote without that. But, up until World War One, Woodrow Wilson was like, he was not in support of the women's vote. And it's really important, if you want to get support for the women's vote, to have the president on your side. He's like, nah. But when World War One comes along, he really wants women's support for that war. Women are presented, and most people think of women as more moral than men, the civilizers, the uplifters, the housekeepers. If he can get women to support this war as the war to end all wars, the war to make the world safe for democracy, that's really going to put a moral stamp on it. And he's presenting this as a moral war. So all of a sudden, Woodrow Wilson is in support of women's suffrage. And he tells Congress he's in support of it and they should support it as a war measure. And even then, it doesn't automatically, get voted in. But I think that's a crucial turning point. Is that World War without World War One, I don't know how long it would have been before women finally got the vote. I think World War One really accelerated women getting suffrage.
But nevertheless, I think both La Follett's, Robert as well as Bell, um, was not a, pro U.S. involvement in the First World War, and yeah, I believe Roberts' his career really suffered because of it, and that brings me to like some of the very interesting debates within the progressive movement. And the first one is in regards to war. TR, a great progressive, but also the big militarist. He agitates for war as a catalyst for more progress. But the La Follettes did not think so. So, what was their disagreements with, say, people like TR regarding war?
They have different perspectives on this. She is really more of a pacifist. She's just against war. He is not a pacifist, but both of them agree that they say this war has really nothing to do with the United States. We have been making progressives have been making real progress in disciplining business. And once we get into war, there's an old expression, you can't have guns and butter. You can't have an expensive war and then also have a lot of domestic reform. So it said, this is a bait and switch that the war industry, of course, wants us to get into war because they're going to not only will they make all kind of profit, but this is going to put the end to progressive reforms. So they say, don't be fooled by this. This is we can't say to the war industry, yes, we need you to, give us all of this equipment and so forth, while we're regulating them. They're going to say, no, if you want this stuff, we have to be able to do it. This is going to set back the progressive movement, a generation. Don't be fooled by this. There's no reason for us to get involved in this war. Our security is not being threatened. This is just it's going to cost, God knows how many lives, and it's not going to make the world safe for democracy. It's not going to be the war to end all wars. It's just going to kill a whole bunch of young men, and it's going to have this legacy of really putting the brakes on progressive reform. So they're against it, for a number of reasons.
So how did the La Follettes make up the, I guess, the Wilsonian reforms as to international affairs after the war? Say, I guess, the Treaty of Versailles, the League of Nations, the principle of self-determination, so on and so on.
Well, originally, Bob La Follette is when he says no, he does not support the League of Nations. Bell La Follette says, "What's the matter with you? I mean, look, this sounds good, and we've got, we're going to have this, peace and League of Nations, all this stuff." And he says, "No, you actually have to read this. You have to read it and look at it carefully. What it's going to do is draw us into all kinds of wars. This is a huge mistake." He said, "I get that you want peace, and I get that you want, this body that we think is going to create peace and so forth. This isn't it." And she's very disappointed, but she looks into it carefully as well, because originally, like I say, she's a little annoyed with him for not supporting this. But he says, "No, don't be fooled. This is just going to drag us into all kinds of stuff." Yeah, yeah.
Now, another commonality between prominent progressives is their sympathy towards the Bolsheviks and the Soviet Union, at least in the early days. And I think that part of their legacy has aged the least well. Of course, Lincoln Steffens famously said, "I've seen the future and it works," when he visit the Soviet Union. And I believe that Bob La Follette in his early days was sympathetic until he actually visited the place and saw that the curtailment of civil liberties is not worth the progress. So what did Bell make of the Soviets?
Well, this is so interesting because you're exactly right. He had basically said, you know, his essential argument was, why are we worrying about the Soviet Union? We've got enough to do at home. This is not our business. And he had some admiration, but as you said, once the La Follettes go there in 1923, he is like, no, no. I see the violation of basic civil liberties, and he's pretty outspoken. She is not quite there yet. She is very much impressed by the fact that women are treated as equals in the Soviet Union. She is thrilled that women are, she talks about women dentists and, just all women in all kinds of professions. And, I think you have to look at how frustrated she'd been at the impairment of women's progress in the United States. So she's really, she's taken by what's happening with women, and she's less willing to be looking as critically as he is on what's happening to free speech, civil rights, and so forth. So they're not in the same mindset about the Soviet Union, and she doesn't say much about it in her final years. But he I don't know whether I would say he had a flirtation with it. And he never says, "Oh, this is great," but he's interested in their experimentation and so forth. But as you point out, once he sees it firsthand, it's like, no, this is not acceptable.
Yes. Now, another conflict within the progressive movement, at least amongst its most prominent advocates, is the question of racial progress. Wilson infamously was against it. And I'm sure the La Follettes, both Bob and Bell, were for it. So, yeah, tell me about what was the argument between these two?
Well, it's so interesting to me. The La Follettes were, I mean, pretty early on really talking about racial equality and how important it was. And not just talking about it, but I mean, at one point, they go to something in New Orleans in the late 1800s. It's his first term in Congress. And they say, where are all the Black people? And they say, oh, we keep them, in their own neighborhood. So they have to hire a carriage to take them through, and they're just appalled by what they see. I mean, they're digging and they're looking at things. And he gives the commencement address at Howard University Law School, and which is, it's an all-Black institution, and gives this really inspirational address, etc. And Belle Follett had been talking about race and was pro-equality, but is saying some kind of cringeworthy things. She's talking about calls little Black children pickaninnies, and, just this kind of, ugh. And then when Woodrow Wilson comes into office and he racially segregates Washington, D.C., where, of course, the La Follettes live, she is appalled by this, and she writes for La Follette's magazine. So she finds a couple of the women who have been working in segregated federal offices for, 10, 11, 12, 13 years, and talks to them about it. And they talk about how demoralized they are and how humiliating it is to suddenly have to eat at separate tables and go to separate bathrooms. And so she writes about this, and surprise, surprise, these three women get fired that she'd been talking with. And she is outraged by this, and she writes a whole bunch of columns about this. And she calls out President Wilson specifically about this, explicitly, and says, this has no place in a democracy. That racial equality is not something that African Americans have earned. She said that's their right. And we can't call ourselves a great nation, a great democracy with this kind of thing going on. And this shy woman who's very self-deprecating speaks to the what they called colored at the YMCA and gets an ovation of several minutes because she just says, she's just like, no, this is outrageous. And she gets a lot of press. And the Washington Post had a headline that says, wife of senator defends Negroes. This is big news. This is this shy woman who's just like, no, I can't be shy about this because this is just unacceptable in this nation. So she really is a real warrior for anti-racism. When she dies, the tributes that she gets from the African American community, they didn't forget this. They are very grateful to her. So she'd started off kind of, in theory, she was anti-racist, but she, but when push comes to shove, man, she really gets in there and fights hard.
Mhm. Yes. Of course, the progressive era was a golden era for Black American leadership. You had your Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. But at the same time, substantive progress for Black Americans were not achieved until like 4 or 5 decades later. So, what were some of the factors that hindered Black American progress at this time?
Well, I think you put your finger on one of them, which is Woodrow Wilson comes to the White House. Wilson's a good old boy from Virginia, and he's really racist, and it's not hard to persuade him to racially segregate the Capitol. And like Bell LaFollette says, racial segregation is terrible everywhere. But when you do it in the nation's capital to a population that has been working in integrated offices, all along. This is a step backwards. I think that, this period after Reconstruction, I get a little impatient when people say, well, we have so many racial problems in the United States. It's a legacy of slavery. And I think, no, I think a lot of it is a legacy of this period. Here was the opportunity, during Reconstruction and the Gilded Age and Progressive Era to say slavery is over. We're going to reconstitute this nation on the basis of racial equality. And instead, we have the legal decision Plessy versus Ferguson, which says you can have separate but equal facilities. I mean, that puts it into federal law that you can racially segregate. I mean, there had to be a lot of work done to ensure that this nation remained really, really racist and segregated, and it does happen during this period. I think it's it's not just a legacy of slavery. It's a legacy that had to be perpetuated and legalized and enforced. And when we see the rise of the KKK again in the 1920s. It's clear that this isn't just a few pieces of legislation. These are big, powerful movements, and they're not just in the South. Indiana had the biggest Klan in the 20s. So I think that racism in this country didn't just happen. It was consciously created and enforced and encouraged and fed, and particularly during this period.
Mhm. I recently read Up From Slavery, Washington's just monumental autobiography, and he mentioned the Ku Klux Klan, and I remember at the time that he was writing it, he remembered like being very fearful of them in his childhood. But at that time, I think it was like 1900 or 1901, the Klan was on their way out. But I think Wilson's presidency was very impactful in bringing the Klan back into prominence.
Well, I think Wilson's presidency kind of gave an okay, when the president approves it and we have escalating segregation. I think that's a very strong signal. I also think that there was, of course, growing concern. We have a whole lot of white American farmers saying, wait a minute. We used to be, this is the American dream, to be a farmer and to be self-sufficient, this whole Jeffersonian idea. All of a sudden we're hicks from the sticks. And people make fun of us, and we have this urbanization and industrialization. all these immigrants, are coming pouring in and taking jobs. It's not unlike what's going on today in the United States. A lot of this same kind of dissatisfaction and looking for a scapegoat. And so the Ku Klux Klan that arose in the 20s is different than the one that arose, right after, during and right after Reconstruction, which was basically focused on African Americans. The Klan of the 20s is against immigrants, it's against Catholics, it's against African Americans, it's against practically anybody who is sort of, seen as a challenge to, this notion of traditional American values, et cetera, et cetera. So they're kind of different movements in some ways. But yeah, I think, like I say, when the president isn't an all-powerful being in this country, but he can signal, a lot of things. You look at Trump, gave a whole lot of people hope and inspiration and so forth. He's going to inspire a very different population than, say, Barack Obama is going to do as president. So yeah, I think that's true of Wilson, and it continues to be true today.
Yeah, a few things to address there. I believe the abrupt end, or some would say the failure of the Reconstruction era, is something that is not studied often enough, and I think requires more examination, because it essentially set back the progress of fully integrating former slaves into full citizenship for decades and decades. And one of the factors that you've touched on too is this Southern Romanticism of that is culminated in the, say, the lost cause ideology. Yeah, of course, some Southern writers that I really admire, like Robert Penn Warren or William Faulkner, sort of strayed away from the racial aspects of it. But some very prominent writers like Thomas Dixon Jr. with the Klansmen and the leopard spots, they really focus on how race was a factor in the corrosion of the South, and to that extent, they agitated people like Klansmen.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're really reinforcing the point that I want to make, is that this isn't just about slavery. It's this whole it took literature, laws, music, all there's all kinds of elements working together to maintain segregation, to maintain racism. It didn't just happen. These are the results of a lot of agitation and work and propaganda. And yeah, and it really the whole, Dixon, he's corresponding with Woodrow Wilson. He's saying, yes, for God's sake, segregate Washington DC. I mean, these aren't all just working in little different silos. There's overlap here. And again, I think your point is exactly right, that I think, is not sufficiently understood in this country. Because I think the myth that, oh, this just kind of happened, really is very, very damaging. It didn't just kind of happen. It was created by conscious effort and a lot of work. And therefore, it's going to take conscious effort and a lot of work to uncreate it. If it didn't just happen, it's not going to just unhappen. And so I think I get impatient when there's not the recognition of what it took to make this country as racist as it was for so long. When you look, as you understand, when you look at radical Reconstruction, that said, look, let's reconstruct the South on the basis of racial equality. Eric Foner, I thought his book on Reconstruction, The Unfinished Revolution, I think that is just such a brilliant title, and it says so much. Yes, this was a revolutionary idea. Let's really reconstruct the South on the basis of racial equality, but we didn't finish that revolution. And I would argue we still haven't finished that revolution.
Mhm. Yes, yeah, Faulkner is just a wonderful historian, and I would say C. Vann Woodward's his Southern historiography is also worth reading as to how the South came to develop as it was post Reconstruction.
Yeah,
Now,
yeah.
Another contested legacy, I believe, of the progressive era is the growing in size and importance of the presidency. Now, you've mentioned how Americans seems to change with one president after the other, and I believe that it is because Americans seem to have taken the presidency a bit too seriously. There are three branches of government, and the executive seems to get all the spotlight in the world. And for me at least, the progressive era, starting with TR and continued by Wilson and FDR, really enlarged the presidency and its importance. So I wonder, well, first, what do you make of it? And also, what did the La Follettes make of it, having been there at the creation, so to speak?
Well, I think, and this is a controversial subject, but from my perspective, I mean, after Abraham Lincoln, when Andrew Johnson is impeached and is almost, loses the presidency, I think we have a series of presidents that most people can't name. There's this whole, can you picture in your mind, the presidents from, say, Lincoln through about Theodore Roosevelt? It's like, I don't know, because I think there was sort of a stepping back. It's like, look, if you get to be too aggressive and so forth in the presidency, you could be impeached, and who wants to be the first one to lose that trial? So we see, kind of not such strong presidents. So, but then when Theodore Roosevelt comes along and we have the return of the active presidency, I think there is, how the La Follettes felt about it. Is I I don't think I think Bob La Follette as a U.S. senator still felt the power of the Senate. He still felt that Congress still had a lot going on, and certainly the Supreme Court has absolute power in ways that there are still these three branches of government, and it's not like the president has just subsumed them all. But I think his frustration, and this is getting me maybe a little out into the weeds, but at one point he and Roosevelt are arguing over a bill about coal regulation. And La Follette says, well, Roosevelt says, well, why don't we, compromise? Why don't we just, do this? And, half a loaf is better than having no bread. And Bob La Follette says, no, no, it's better to have no bread because then you're hungry and you fight for the whole loaf. And Roosevelt is like, no, that's crazy. Politics is the art of compromise and so forth. So I don't think that Bob La Follette is frustrated so much with Roosevelt because he's president. He's just frustrated that he's not being president the way that he wants to be. I don't know that Bob La Follette could have imagined, any politician from that period could have imagined what the presidency and sort of the mystique that surrounds it and its power has become today. I think you're right that the presidents were more colorful and better known and more powerful than they had been for the last couple of decades, but not I think to where they are today. I'm not sure I even answered your question. I don't know. I got a little lost in the weeds there.
Yeah, yeah, I suppose I like to ask for like your view because for me at least it doesn't matter who the president happens to be in the office, and I think starting in the 2000s we get very divisive and sometimes not so competent presidents. uh, I would say that it is the a large presidency that in some ways impede upon how American government is supposed to function, and it's is some ways a good thing that that presidents say between Lincoln and TR they sort of step back a little bit. I think of people like Grover Cleveland, for example. He was brilliant, and nobody remembered him too much today, despite the fact that he was the first president ever to be elected in like two non-consecutive terms. Um,
Right, right.
so people who are like that, and I think people like Calvin Coolidge is also an example of a president who steps back a little bit. They realize
Mhm.
that you're just one of the three branches of government, and need to honor the separation of powers, so and so.
Well, I think right now, after the overturning of Roe versus Wade, I think there's a real recognition in this country right now of the power of the Supreme Court.
Mhm,
Um, and I would also say that it's been frustrating, I think, for both parties. They get their president in, but then they don't have Congress and they can't get anything done. So I think that in my view, yes, the presidency has sort of been enlarged, but these checks and balances are still working. They're not working the way that I particularly like them to, but I do think that those are a couple of examples of the fact that Congress and the Supreme Court still wield a lot of power and control in this country.
mhm. Yes. Yeah. Would you say that the power of Congress was the same as it was when the Follets were in power, especially Bob, fighting Bob, I mean?
I don't know that I really know how to answer that question. I mean, in some ways, things have changed so much. Um, but I also think that it kind of does make your point. Um, I really don't know as much about what's going on in Congress as I should, and I think most Americans don't. But I had a hard time getting a contract and promoting that biography of Bob LaFollette because people don't want to read about senators and
Mhm,
members of Congress. They want to read about presidents. And so I think often members of Congress don't get the recognition that they deserve for what they're doing. I remember arguing with another scholar about something about LaFollette, and I said, look, sometimes it's not so much what a member of Congress achieves, but what he or she prevents. If you are trying to get something through Congress in the day of Ted Kennedy, you knew the power that he had, whatever it was, that wasn't going to happen. It's not just what you get through, but what you prevent from getting through. So I think sometimes today, as in the past, a lot of Congress doesn't get the. It's a different kind of leadership, and it's not as easy to understand, and it's more complex. And I don't pretend to understand it, but I do think it gets somewhat underrated.
mhm. Yes, yes, I think so too. I think one example, for example, and I think it brings it closer to home is that only Congress has the power to declare war, and throughout what we call the Vietnam War, President Johnson has never received congressional approval for his military actions, as he called them.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's and after that, it was just like, no, no, we're not doing that again. This has been a big fight in Congress. It's like, no, no. And also things like, I mean, Franklin Roosevelt's body wasn't cool before Congress passed the amendment that says you can't serve more than 2 terms as
Mhm.
president. We're going to curtail, this right now. Up until that point, it wasn't, that, he was the only one who done it. It was like, no, no, we are reasserting ourselves here. And I think this has been a big issue in this country, the declaration of war, for example. It's just like, no, no, you can't say, oh, we have the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, and therefore we can, have this war in Vietnam and it extends forever and so forth. I think there are times when Congress is really fighting, really fighting back and saying, no, we these are our enumerated powers and we intend to use them.
Right. So going back to Bella Follett, of course. So I wonder at the end of her life, what are some of the things that she was I guess satisfactory? What are some of the progress in which she was satisfactory about, and what are some that she wish could have been achieved more?
She is certainly thrilled that women finally got the vote. She's very, very pleased about that. But she has and she's pleased about a lot of the progressive reforms that were moving forward. I mean, she, of course, is devoted to the people of Wisconsin, and she believes that, their everyday lives are better because of progressive reforms. They can get pure food and drugs. They don't have to work ungodly hours. There are protections for workers. There are these environmental protections. I mean, the corrupt politics did not disappear, but they certainly aren't as extreme as they had been. So I think that she really believes that there has been that the real progressive goals are the lives of Americans made better by what we have achieved. She says absolutely they have been. Are we done? No. Do there continue to be all kinds of problems? Yes. And she advocates for just this huge range of reforms. She's one of the first to really campaign for being able to cast your vote by mail. She said, "Do you know how hard it is for rural people to go into town to vote? Why can't we do this by mail?" She just said this just seems stupid. Why do we have the presidential inauguration in January when it's freezing in Washington, D.C.? Why don't we move it to another time? She's just like, yeah, just because things have been done a certain way forever, we should make them better. I mean, those are just two little things that she campaigned for. She campaigned for all kinds of stuff. She's very worried about another world war and all kinds of topics. So she's willing. She can see that real progress has been made, and for her, rather than resting on her laurels, it's like, yes, real progress can be made, so we have to keep making it.
So, final question. So following the example of Bella Follett, what do you suppose are some of the contributions that women can make in the political discourse? Yeah, not just in the sphere of voting.
I think women like men, the key thing is that you have to see government that you are part of this. That you're not just waiting for the leaders, that we have these elected leaders, and therefore, it's going to be handled. I think the most important idea in American democracy, it's a participatory democracy. What are you doing personally to make things better, to make your views known? Are you going to protests? I mean, no matter what side of politics you are on, I think the real key is that you recognize that it's not your job to sit back and let other people do things, that you have to either by writing a check or writing a letter or going to an event or whatever it is that you be part of this. And I don't think it matters whether you're a man or a woman. I think that this is what is really key, that you are part of this democracy, not just someone who's being served by the leaders.
I think that's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you very much, Professor Nancy Unger, for joining the show once again.
Thank you so much.